When people think about surviving a plains winter, they think about the surface. More wood, more hauling, more trips to town before the roads break. They think about sealing every crack, stacking every cord, fighting the cold at ground level where the wind lives and the snow piles and the temperature can drop 50 degrees before dark. But here is what they never consider. The surface is where winter kills you. The yards disappear. The doors seal shut. The wood you stacked becomes unreachable. The cabin you built becomes a coffin. One man understood something different. He understood that survival was not about building outward into the storm. It was about building downward into stable ground, into the stillness beneath the wind, where the temperature does not change and the drifts cannot reach. What he hid under his firewood shed looked like madness, until the blizzard buried everything else. He had arrived in southeastern Dakota Territory in August of 1887 with a wife, a 6-year-old daughter, and $31 after debts. The partner who was supposed to split the claim had vanished 3 weeks before, taking the second wagon and the stronger team. The freight contract that was supposed to fund the first winter had collapsed when the rail siding changed hands. What remained was a quarter section of open prairie, a cabin with gaps in the chinking wide enough to slide a knife through, and a half-framed woodshed that held nothing. Marta stood in the doorway of the cabin with Anna pressed against her skirt. Neither of them spoke. The wind came across the grass in long waves, and somewhere to the north, the sky had the color of a bruise that would not heal. Niels Halverson Brecka had been a timber cutter and river laborer in Minnesota. He knew how to swing an axe until his shoulders burned, and how to stack cord after cord until the pile looked like a wall. What he did not know was how to make $31, one milk cow, and a single small stove keep 3 people alive through a plains winter when the nearest neighbor was 2 miles off, and the nearest rail siding was a hard day's travel in good weather. He could not leave. There was no money for passage back. There were no relatives to take them in. The claim was filed. The debt was owed. The only direction was forward, into a winter that everyone said would bury them. Within 2 weeks of arrival, word traveled. A man named Ephraim Cutter rode up on a morning when frost had already touched the grass. Cutter was 58 years old. He had driven freight on the Red River routes for 3 decades. He had lost 2 ox teams to separate winter storms and kept settlements supplied anyway. His hands were scarred across the knuckles from frostbite that had healed badly, and his left ear was missing the top quarter inch. When he walked the property, he did not ask permission. He simply walked, and Niels followed. Cutter stopped at the cabin first. He pressed his palm against the south wall and felt the gyve in the logs. He looked at the stovepipe, the single window, the door that did not sit flush in its frame. He said nothing. Then he walked to the woodshed frame, looked at the empty space beneath the half-finished roof, and turned to face Niels directly. "One cabin," Cutter said. "One stove. Not enough cordwood to see you through November, let alone February. No second shelter, no proper cellar, no root storage worth the name." Niels started to speak, but Cutter raised a hand. "I am not finished." He pointed toward the north, where the horizon was flat and featureless and offered nothing. "When the blizzard comes, and it will come, the wind does not stop at your door. It comes through every crack you have not sealed, and then it comes through the cracks you thought you sealed. The snow does not fall. It flies sideways. It buries your shed. It buries your yard. It buries your door. And if you have not prepared, it buries you." Cutter stepped closer. His voice dropped. "You keep your wife and that little girl in this county with one cabin and one stove, and the blizzard will bury all 3 of you together." Niels felt the words land like stones. He wanted to argue, but he had no argument. Everything Cutter said was true. "What would you have me do?" Niels asked. "Haul more, cut more, seal more. Make 6 trips to town before the roads break instead of 3. Buy on credit if you have to. Sell the cow if you must. Do what every man who has survived out here has done." Cutter paused. Or sell the claim now, take what you can get, and leave before the first real storm. I cannot sell. The debt? Then haul, cut, seal. That is your only answer. Cutter mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. That night, Niels sat at the table in the cabin while Marta put Anna to bed behind the curtain. The single lamp threw shadows against the walls. He could hear the wind testing the gaps in the chinking. He counted the wood he had. He counted the wood he needed. The numbers did not meet. They were not close. The cow could be sold, but that meant no milk for Anna, no manure for fuel, no breeding for the future. More trips to town meant more exposure on roads that could vanish under drift. More credit meant more debt to a man who would own him by spring, and all of it assumed he could cut enough wood. Alone. With one axe. In the weeks that remained before true cold. He had been a timber cutter. He knew what was possible. He knew what was not. Marta came to the table and sat across from him. She did not ask what Cutter had said. She had heard enough through the walls. "Is it as bad as he says?" she asked. "Worse. He's being kind." "Then what do we do?" Niels did not answer. He stared at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the knots that ran through it like frozen rivers. Somewhere in his memory a different table surfaced, a different cabin, a different winter. He was 12 years old, standing beside his father in Minnesota. His father, Halvor, was a Norwegian-born laborer who had worked timber in the old country before crossing the Atlantic. They were at a neighbor's homestead, and Halvor was showing Niels something strange. The neighbor had a turf-roofed cache built into a hillside. A frost-rimmed hatch, barely visible, opened into darkness. Halvor lifted the hatch and climbed down, and Niels followed with a lantern. Below, the air was different. The cutting wind was gone. The temperature was steady. The smell was wet earth, lantern soot, split pole sap. Vegetables lined the walls in wooden bins. Smoked meat hung from crossbeams. Water barrels stood in the corner, unfrozen. Halvor had put his hand on the earthen wall. "The ground keeps what the air steals," he said. "Remember that. The cold above changes. The cold below holds still." Niels had remembered. For 20 years he had remembered without knowing why. Now, sitting in a cabin on the open Dakota prairie with a wife, a daughter, and $31, he began to understand. A week later, Niels walked out to the half-finished woodshed and stood inside the frame. The wind came through the open sides without resistance. The ground beneath was hard, but workable. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the dirt. The air above was cold and sharp. The ground was cold too, but different, steadier, deeper. He thought about what Cutter had said. More hauling, more cutting, more of the same things every settler did, competing for the same scarce resources with the same insufficient time. Then he thought about his father's lesson. The surface was where the wind lived. The surface was where the snow piled. The surface was where men froze because they had nowhere else to go. But below the surface, the rules changed. He did not need to outrun winter on the surface. He needed to go under it. That night, he did not sleep. He sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a charcoal stick, drawing lines that made no sense to anyone but him. A shaft going down, a tunnel going out, a chamber opening at the end, a hatch disguised beneath stacked wood. Not a root cellar. Those were shallow, single-purpose, obvious. What he was imagining was different. A hidden system. A way to move, breathe, and reach supplies when the entire surface world was buried. Marta woke to find him still drawing. She looked at the paper, at the lines and measurements, at the words scrawled in Norwegian. "What is this?" she asked. "I do not know yet, but I think it might be why we survive." The next afternoon, Jonas Pritchard rode over. Jonas was a neighbor 2 miles east, a decent man with a decent claim and a family of his own. He had heard about the stranger who was late to the season and short on supplies. He came to see for himself. Niels was behind the woodshed with a shovel when Jonas found him. There was a small hole in the ground, perhaps 2 feet deep. Dirt was piled to one side. Jonas dismounted and walked over. He looked at the hole, looked at Niels, and frowned. "You dig in a well?" "No." "Cellar?" "Something like it." Jonas crouched at the edge of the hole and studied it. He was a practical man. He ran a practical operation. He did not understand what he was seeing. "You cannot even stand upright in a hole that size," Jonas said. "What good is it?" "It is not finished." "Even finished, what good is a cellar you cannot stand in? Every hour you spend digging down here is an hour you are not cutting wood, an hour you are not hauling supplies, an hour you are not sealing that cabin of yours." Niels wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "I know. Then why?" "Because the surface is not where I need to be when the storm comes." Jonas stood up. He looked at the half-finished shed, at the small pile of split wood beside it, at the cabin with its gaps and cracks. He shook his head. "You're betting your family on a hole in the ground that nobody can even walk through." "I am betting my family on the idea that the ground holds steady when the air does not." Jonas mounted his horse. "I hope you are right, for their sake." He rode away without looking back, and Niels returned to his shovel. The hole became a shaft. The shaft reached 4 feet, then 5, then dropped below what Niels estimated was the frost line. His shoulders ached, his hands blistered, broke, and blistered again. He worked by lantern light after dark, when the neighbors could not see the spoil he was piling behind the shed. Marta watched. She did not say anything at first. She brought him water and food. She kept Anna away from the work site, but the questions built behind her eyes, and one night she finally asked, "What are you building?" Niels took her to the shed. He moved aside a stack of split wood. The stack was deliberately placed, he explained, and lifted a rough-cut hatch. Below, the lantern light showed a vertical shaft with wooden rungs set into the walls. At the bottom, a dark horizontal opening led away into blackness. "A tunnel," Marta said. "You have built a tunnel." "The beginning of one. It goes 20 feet so far. At the end, I'm opening a chamber, big enough for shelves, big enough for barrels, big enough for you and Anna to sleep if the cabin fails." Marta was silent for a long moment. Then she descended. The shaft was narrow. The tunnel was narrower. But the chamber at the end, rough and unfinished, was already large enough to crouch in without hitting her head. The walls were packed earth, braced at intervals with sapling poles. The air smelled of dirt and work and cold that did not cut. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked. "Because I did not know if it would hold. I still do not know. But it is a chance, the only kind of chance I can make." Marta climbed back out. She did not say anything about the labor he had hidden. She did not say anything about the risk. She looked at him in the lamplight, and for the first time since they had arrived, something in her face changed. "Then we finish it together," she said. The first week of October, a man rode up to the shed while Niels was sawing sapling poles into lengths. The man did not dismount. He sat on his horse and watched. Silas Rook was the storekeeper at the nearest settlement. He held notes on several claims in the district. He was not a large man, but he carried himself as if he owned everything he looked at, and in many cases, he did. Rook studied the shed, the woodpile, the work in progress. He did not greet Niels. He simply spoke. "You are the one who arrived late and short." "I arrived," Niels said. "The rest is my concern." "Your concern, maybe, but when the claim fails, it becomes my concern. I've seen a dozen men dig cellars like yours. They all thought they were clever. They all thought they found the answer. They all came to me by February, begging to sell their cow, their tools, their claim. Niels kept sawing. You can eat a cellar, can you? Rook continued. Can your girl breathe dirt when the drifts close? You came out here to tell me I will fail? I came out here to make you an offer. Sell the cow now, $30, clean cash, before the weather makes the choice for you. The cow is not for sale. Rook smiled. It was not a kind smile. Remember I offered. When you come to me in January, the price will be different. He turned his horse and rode away. That night Niels told Marta what had happened. She listened in silence, and when he finished, she spoke. He's right about one thing. We cannot eat a tunnel. We can reach food that would be unreachable without it. Then the food must be there when we need it. From that night forward, Marta took charge of the provisions. She calculated rations. She packed root vegetables in sand and ash. She directed where each barrel should be placed in the unfinished chamber. Niels built, Marta planned, and Anna, who understood nothing except that something important was happening underground, learned to keep the secret. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to keep working on something important while everyone around you thought it made no sense? October brought a visitor Niels did not expect. Iver Tollefson Moen was 62 years old, widowed, and living alone in a cut-bank dwelling half a mile off the creek. He had come through bad winters in both Minnesota and Dakota country. He had built dugouts and cellars that were still standing when the men who had mocked him were long dead. He rode up to the shed on a gray afternoon when the light was flat and the wind smelled of snow that had not yet fallen. Niels was in the shaft, bracing a section of tunnel wall that had started to bow inward. Iver dismounted without a word. He walked to the edge of the shaft, looked down at Niels, and nodded. Your sapling spacing is too wide, he said. Niels stopped working. He looked up at the old man with the weathered face and the hands that had clearly done this work before. How do you know what I am building? I do not, but I know a roof brace when I see one, and yours is going to sag before spring. Iver gestured. Come up, let me show you. Niels climbed out of the shaft. Iver picked up one of the cut saplings and held it across his palm. Green wood, Iver said. That is good. Green wood bends before it cracks, but you are spacing them too far apart. When the dirt settles and the frost works, the load shifts. You need them closer together and seated in opposing notches, so the weight spreads into the sidewalls instead of bearing straight down. How do you know this? Iver looked at him. Because I have seen men crushed under roofs that were built by men who thought they knew. That afternoon, Iver stayed. He did not ask permission. He simply worked alongside Niels, adjusting the bracing, showing him how to cut the notches, explaining why certain soils held and others sloughed. You do not cut a wall clean and vertical in this ground, Iver said. It will come down on you. Leave a slight batter. Pack the spoil where the load needs it. Never trust a surface that looks stable. Niels listened. He corrected his work. And when the sun dropped and the cold sharpened, Iver did not say goodbye. He said, I will come back tomorrow. The mentor came back the next day, and the day after that. Iver taught through action, not lecture. He showed Niels how to read the earth, how to feel when a ceiling was starting to shift, how to position support poles so they held without blocking movement. He showed him how to zone the storage, smoked meat higher and drier, roots lower in bins where the cold damp helped them last. Quiet ventilation, Iver said one afternoon. They were in the main chamber, which had grown large enough to hold a man standing hunched. A hidden place still needs breath, but a big pipe will ice shut. Give the air 2 weak paths, not one strong one. Let it seep. Niels had not thought of that. He had been planning a single ventilation shaft. Now he understood why that was wrong. You have done this before, Niels said. I have done this all my life. First in the old country, then in Minnesota, then here. The surface is where the weather lives. The earth is where we live when the weather turns against us. Then why do men not build like this? Why do they stack wood above ground and freeze when the storms come? Ivar sat down on an overturned bucket. He was quiet for a long moment. Because they cannot see it. They see the cabin. They see the shed. They see the woodpile. Those are things they understand. A hole in the ground is not a thing. It is an absence. Men do not trust absences. He looked at Niels. But you trust it? I saw it when I watched you work. You are not digging because you are desperate. You are digging because you understand something they do not. That is why I came back. November brought the first real cold. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single night, and the ground that had been merely hard became iron. Niels worked anyway. His hands cracked, his shoulders burned. But the chamber was nearly complete. Then the setback came. A warm spell in mid-November softened the ground unexpectedly. Water seeped into the tunnel walls. One section began to bulge inward. Niels went down to inspect it and heard the sound no underground builder wants to hear, a wet, settling groan. He barely made it out before the section collapsed. Dirt poured into the tunnel like a slow river. The work of 2 weeks was gone in 2 minutes. Marta found him standing at the edge of the shaft, staring down at the damage. Can it be fixed? It has to be fixed. There is no other choice. She did not argue. She did not comfort. She handed him a lantern and said, Then start tonight. He started that night, and when Ivar came the next morning, he looked at the collapsed section and said only, This happens. Now you know what failure feels like. That knowledge is worth more than the time you lost. They rebuilt the section together. Ivar showed Niels how to shore the walls against future water intrusion, how to pack clay into the weak spots, how to recognize the early signs of instability. The work took another 10 days, but when it was done, it was stronger than before. December came hard and fast. The cow sickened with something in her stomach, and for 3 days they did not know if she would live. Anna developed a cough that kept Marta awake through the nights. The first snow fell and stayed, packing against the shed walls, making every trip between cabin and work site a struggle. And still the chamber grew. By mid-December, it was complete enough to be usable. The main chamber was 7 feet wide, 9 feet long, and tall enough for Niels to stand hunched. Shelves lined one wall. Barrels stood against another. The tunnel back to the shaft was braced with saplings every 2 feet. A secondary alcove, still rough, opened to the east. Niels lowered the provisions. Crocks of pickled vegetables, sacks of grain, potatoes wrapped in burlap, turnips in sand, carrots in ash, smoked venison, bacon sides, dried beans. 2 water barrels went down last, lowered on ropes, positioned where the cold would keep them liquid but not frozen. Marta came down to inspect. Anna followed, wide-eyed, holding her mother's hand. It is like a secret room, Anna whispered. It is, Niels said. And we do not tell anyone about it. Do you understand? Anna nodded. She understood secrets. She had been keeping this one for weeks. That night, Niels sealed the final ventilation gaps, 2 small openings disguised in the shed's exterior walls, angled so snow would not pack into them directly. He stacked the split wood over the hatch until the trap was invisible. From outside, the shed looked like any other frontier woodshed. Nothing suggested what lay beneath. The morning of January 11th, 1888, began mild. The temperature was in the 20s, cold but not killing. The sky was clear. Jonas Pritchard rode over to check on them, and Niels met him in the yard. You made it to January, Jonas said. I did not think you would. There is more winter left. There is always more winter. But you have stores now. You have wood. You might survive after all. He paused. What did you do with that hole of yours? The one you were digging in the fall? I finished it. And? Did it hold? We will find out. Jonas laughed, but it was not an unkind laugh. You are a strange man, Niels Brecke, but you are still here. That counts for something. He rode away. The sky, Niels noticed, had changed color while they talked. A thin band of cloud stretched along the western horizon. The wind had shifted. By noon, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. By mid-afternoon, it had dropped another 15. By evening, the sky had closed into a solid gray wall, and the wind had teeth. Niels brought Marta and Anna to the window of the cabin. He pointed at the horizon. Do you see that? I see clouds. Those are not clouds. That is a wall of wind carrying everything in front of it. When it arrives, we will not be able to see the shed. We will not be able to see the yard. We will not be able to see our own hands. Marta's face changed. How long? Hours, maybe less. What do we do? Niels turned from the window. We move to the shed. Now. They crossed the yard as the first gusts hit. The temperature was still falling, 40 degrees below where it had been that morning. The wind cut through their coats as if the fabric were paper. Anna cried out, and Marta carried her the last 20 feet. Inside the shed, the stacked wood blocked some of the wind, but the cold came through the walls. Niels lit a lantern and moved directly to the hatch. Help me clear this. They pulled split logs aside until the trap was exposed. Niels lifted it. Warm air, not warm, but warmer, rose from the darkness below. You first, he said to Marta. Take Anna. Marta descended the ladder with Anna clinging to her back. Niels followed with the lantern. He pulled the trap shut above them, and the sound of the wind became muffled, then distant. The chamber was cold, but it was still. The packed earth walls held a temperature that had not changed in weeks. The stored food lined the shelves in neat rows. The water barrels stood in the corner, a thin film of ice on the surface, but liquid beneath. It works, Marta whispered. It has to keep working, Niels said. We are not safe yet. Above them, the storm began to scream. The night that followed was the longest of their lives. The wind did not stop. It rose and rose until the noise became a physical pressure, a constant howl that shook the shed timbers above them. Snow did not fall so much as it flew sideways, driven by gusts that packed it into drifts taller than a man in minutes. Niels climbed the ladder twice to check the hatch. Both times he could barely force it open against the weight of the snow building above. The second time, he saw that the yard had vanished. The cabin was a darker shape in the white, nothing more. The shed door was buried to the top of the frame. When he descended, his face was white with cold. How bad? Marta asked. The door is gone, packed solid. We cannot go out that way. Then how do we stay here. We wait. And if the structure holds, we survive. Anna was curled on a makeshift pallet of blankets in the corner. Her fever had worsened during the descent. Her forehead burned hot against Marta's hand. She coughed in fits that shook her small body. She needs to be warm, Marta said. She is warmer here than she would be in the cabin. The stove would have died by now. The cabin does not have enough wood to fight this. Are you certain? Niels did not answer. He was not certain of anything, but he knew the math. The cabin held heat only as long as the stove burned. The stove burned only as long as there was wood, and no man could carry wood from the shed to the cabin in a whiteout that could kill him in the time it took to cross the yard. Below ground, they had food. They had water. They had air. They had shelter from the wind. It was enough. It had to be enough. The storm raged for 2 days. On the second night, a sound came from above that stopped Niels's heart, a deep, grinding groan, followed by the thud of weight shifting. Dirt sifted through one of the tunnel seams. Marta grabbed Anna and pulled her away from the wall. "Is it collapsing?" Marta asked. Niels did not know. He took the lantern and crawled into the tunnel. The seam was leaking dirt in a thin stream, but the sapling braces were holding. Above, the load had shifted, probably snow weight on the shed roof, but the structure was absorbing it. He crawled back to the chamber. "It is holding. For now." For now is not enough. For now is all we have. They did not sleep that night. They sat together in the cold, still air, listening to the sounds of the earth around them. Anna's fever rose and broke. Marta cried quietly in the darkness, and Niels held her without speaking. In the morning, the wind finally dropped. Niels climbed the ladder. The hatch would not open. He pushed harder. Still nothing. The weight above was too great. He descended and thought. Then he took a short-handled shovel from the wall and climbed again. This time he did not try to lift the hatch. He pushed it sideways, breaking the seal of packed snow. Light came through, gray, diffuse, cold. He climbed out into a world transformed. The shed was half buried. The roof was intact, but the walls were encased in drift up to the eaves. Beyond, the yard was a smooth white plain, interrupted only by the cabin's chimney pipe and the top of a fence post. Niels stood on the packed snow and breathed. Then he began to dig. If you're invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. It took Niels 4 hours to clear a path from the shed hatch to the cabin. The work was brutal. The snow was packed hard by wind, and every shovelful had to be thrown twice to reach ground level. His arms burned, his back screamed, his lungs ached from breathing air that cut like glass. But he kept digging. When he finally reached the cabin door, he found it buried under 6 feet of drift. He dug that out too. The door swung open onto a dark, frozen interior. The stove had gone cold 2 days ago. The water bucket was solid ice. The bed was covered in frost. If they had stayed here, they would have died. Niels returned to the shed and descended to the chamber. Marta was waiting at the bottom of the ladder. "The cabin is dead," he said, "but we are not." They brought food up from the stores. They relit the cabin stove with wood nils dragged from the buried shed. They warmed broth over the fire and fed Anna small sips until her color began to return. That afternoon, Jonas Pritchard fought his way through the drifts from his own claim. His face was white with cold and dark with fear. He had lost sensation in 3 fingers. He had burned wood at twice the rate he planned because his cabin was not sealed well enough to hold heat. He had run out of food that morning. "How are you alive?" he asked when he saw them. Niels took him to the shed. He showed him the hatch. He showed him the ladder, the tunnel, the chamber, the stores. Jonas stood in the underground room for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Niels. "You built a second winter under the first one," he said. "I built what my father taught me. I just made it bigger." Jonas's eyes were wet. "Can you help the widow on the quarter section north? She has a boy with her. They have been trapped since yesterday. I do not know if they are still alive." Niels gathered food from the stores, broth, potatoes, smoked meat. He and Jonas fought their way across the drifts to the widow's claim. Her cabin was buried to the windows. They dug their way in and found her huddled with her son, under every blanket she owned. The boy was not moving. Niels built a fire. He heated broth. He forced it between the boy's lips until the color came back to his face, and he started to cough. The widow wept silently in the corner. "How did you know what to do?" she asked. I did not know. I learned. That night, Niels returned to his own claim. The temperature had dropped again, and the stars were hard and bright above the frozen plain. He stood outside the shed and looked at the buried yard, the half-visible cabin, the drifts that had tried to kill his family. They were alive. The stores were intact. The chamber had held. It was not a miracle. It was planning. It was labor. It was the knowledge his father had given him, combined with the skills Ivor had taught him, combined with the desperate mathematics of a man who could not afford to fail. The skeptics had said he would be buried. They had been right about the burying. They had been wrong about the dying. 3 days after the storm broke, Ephraim Cutter rode up to the Brecka claim. The drifts were still shoulder-high in places, but paths had been cut between the surviving homesteads. Men had started moving again, counting losses, measuring what remained. The count was not good. 2 families had lost livestock to exposure. 1 man had lost 3 toes to frostbite. A child on a claim to the west had died of pneumonia brought on by cold and hunger. Cutter dismounted in the yard and stood looking at the half-buried shed. Jonas Pritchard had told him what was underneath. He had not believed it. Now he had come to see for himself. Niels met him at the shed door. He did not speak. He simply pulled aside the stacked wood and lifted the hatch. Cutter looked down into the darkness. Then, without a word, he descended the ladder. The chamber was lit by a single lantern. Cutter stood in the center and turned slowly, taking in the packed earth walls, the sapling bracing, the shelves lined with provisions, the barrels of water that had not frozen solid. He pressed his palm against the wall the way he had pressed it against the cabin wall 4 months earlier. The earth was cold, but it was steady. The air was still. The temperature had not moved in weeks. Cutter climbed back out. He stood in the shed and looked at Niels for a long moment. "I told you 1 cabin and 1 stove would bury you," he said. "You did." "I was wrong." Cutter paused. The words did not come easily. "You built yourself a second winter under the first one. I have been on this prairie for 30 years, and I have never seen a man do what you did. My father taught me. A man named Ivor Tollefson showed me how to make it hold." "Tollefson, the old Norwegian in the cut bank?" "Yes." Cutter nodded slowly. "He knows things most men have forgotten. I should have listened to him years ago." He looked back at the hatch. "Can you teach others to build this?" "I can show them. Whether they build it depends on whether they are willing to dig. Some will dig. After this storm, some will dig." Cutter mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he turned back. "I owe you an apology, Brecka. I told you to sell your cow and leave. I told you you would die. I was the one who did not understand. You were trying to help. You told me what you knew. I told you what I thought I knew. There is a difference." He touched his hat. "I will send men to you. Men who want to learn." He rode away. Niels watched him go, and for the first time since August, he felt something other than fear. The men came. Jonas Pritchard came first. He brought a shovel and a lantern and spent an entire afternoon in the chamber asking questions. How deep did Niels dig before he started the tunnel? How did he know when the earth would hold? How did he keep the walls from collapsing? How did he manage ventilation without letting in snow? Niels answered every question. He showed Jonas the spacing of the saplings, the angle of the walls, the positioning of the ventilation gaps. He explained the principles Ivor had taught him: green wood, opposing notches, slight batter on vertical cuts. "I cannot build this alone," Jonas said. "Neither could I. Ivor helped me. I will help you." "Why? I laughed at you. I told you it was foolish." "Because my daughter is alive. If your children die next winter because I was too proud to teach you, that is not victory. That is waste." Jonas was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. When do we start? Spring, when the ground thaws enough to dig. Others followed. A man named Torsten Flatten from 3 miles south, a widow named Birgit Solheim, who had nearly lost her son in the storm, a young couple, newly married, who had arrived in the fall and survived only because they had stumbled into a neighbor's soddy during the whiteout. Each one came to the shed. Each one descended the ladder. Each one stood in the chamber and understood what Niels had built. He did not charge them. He did not demand payment or partnership or shares in their claims. He showed them the principles and let them adapt the design to their own situations. Every claim is different, he told them. The soil is different. The water table is different. The slope is different. I cannot give you a plan that works everywhere. I can give you the thinking. You have to do the building. Some understood. Some did not. Those who understood began digging when the ground thawed. Those who did not went back to stacking wood above ground and hoping the next storm would be less severe. Silas Rook heard about what was happening. He did not like it. Rook had built his position in the district by being the man desperate settlers came to when they had nothing left. He bought livestock cheap. He bought tools cheaper. He bought claims for pennies when the owners were dead or broken. A bad winter was good for Silas Rook. A very bad winter was very good. But this winter had been different. The storm had been severe, yes. People had suffered. But the suffering had not translated into the desperate sales Rook expected. The Brika family, which should have been destroyed, was thriving. The neighbors who should have come begging were digging holes in the ground instead. Rook rode to the store one morning and found 3 men talking about root cellars and tunnel bracing and sapling spacing. They stopped talking when he walked in, but he had heard enough. That afternoon, he rode to the Brika claim. Niels was in the yard, splitting wood for the spring repairs. He did not stop working when Rook arrived. I hear you are teaching men to build underground, Rook said. I'm showing them what I know. Generous of you. Most men would charge for knowledge like that. Most men would be wrong. Rook dismounted and walked closer. His voice dropped. You are making a mistake, Breka. You're giving away something that has value. And you're making enemies of the men who do not like their neighbors learning tricks that keep them off the debtors' list. Niels stopped splitting. He looked at Rook directly. Are you one of those men? I am a man who understands how this country works. Winter kills the weak. Spring belongs to the strong. That is the order of things. You are disrupting the order. If the order requires children to freeze so that you can buy their father's claims, then the order should be disrupted. Rook's face hardened. You will regret this. Sooner or later, you will need something I have. And when that day comes, I will remember this conversation. He mounted his horse and rode away. Niels watched him go, then returned to his splitting. The threat was real. But so was the work. Spring came slowly. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing the damage the storm had done. Fence posts were snapped. A section of the shed roof had buckled under the weight. The cabin's south wall had settled unevenly, and the door no longer closed properly. Niels spent April and May repairing what could be repaired. Marta worked beside him, holding boards while he nailed, mixing chinking compound while he sealed. Anna, recovered from her fever, played in the mud and brought them water when they called for it. And when the repairs were done, Niels went to Ever's cut-bank dwelling. The old man was thinner than he had been in the fall. His cough had worsened through the winter, and his hands shook when he lifted things, but his eyes were still sharp, and when Niels proposed what he had in mind, Iver smiled. You want to build a larger chamber, Iver said. One that can serve more than just your family. I want to build a teaching chamber, a place where men can come and see the principles in action, not just a survival hole, something that shows what is possible. That will take more than saplings and packed earth. That will take proper timber framing, stone footings, drainage channels. I know. That is why I need you. Ivor was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed himself up from his chair. I'm not long for this work, Niels. My body is failing. But I can show you what I know, and if you pay attention, you can carry it forward after I'm gone. They began that week. Together, they laid out a plan for an expanded underground complex, a main chamber large enough for 6 people to stand upright, a secondary storage wing, a ventilation system that used angled shafts instead of direct openings, a drainage channel cut into the lowest point of the floor. Ivor taught as they worked. He showed Niels how to read the grain of timber, how to recognize when a beam was starting to fail, how to cut joints that would hold for decades instead of years. He showed him how to calculate the load on a ceiling based on the soil above it, how to reinforce weak points without overbuilding, how to balance the cost of materials against the risk of failure. The ground keeps what the air steals, Ivor said one afternoon. They were in the new chamber, setting the final roof beam. Your father told you that. He was right. But there is more to it. What more? The ground keeps still when everything above it is moving. That is its gift, but it also keeps dark when everything above it is light. It keeps close when everything above it is open. Some men cannot live that way. They need sky above them and wind on their faces. For those men, this is not salvation. It is a grave. Niels considered this. Then who is it for? For the men who understand that survival is not about comfort. It is about breath. It is about food. It is about the next day. The men who can trade sky for survival, those are the men who will live. The chamber was finished in June. Ivor did not live to see the first winter it served. Ivor died in August, 3 weeks before the first frost. Niels found him in the morning, sitting in his chair by the window of his cut-bank dwelling, his hands folded in his lap. His face was peaceful. His eyes were closed. Whatever pain he had carried through the last months had finally released him. Niels sat with him for a long time before going to find help. They buried Ivor on a small rise overlooking the creek. The men who came to the burial were few: Niels, Jonas, Torsten Flatten, 2 others who had known him in the old days. There was no preacher. Niels spoke the words he could find. He taught me how to build under the ground, Niels said, but he also taught me how to think. He said the earth keeps still when everything above it is moving. He was right about that. And now he is part of the earth himself. The men filled the grave. Niels stood at the edge until the last shovel of dirt was placed. That night he sat in the new chamber, Ivor's chamber. He called it now, and felt the weight of what he had been given. The old man's knowledge was his. The old man's skills were his. But the old man himself was gone, and Niels would have to carry forward alone. The second winter tested him differently. October brought an early cold snap that caught several families unprepared. A man named Halvor Vangen, a distant cousin through Niels's mother's family, arrived at the Brecka claim with his wife and 2 children. Their cabin had burned when an ember from the stove caught the roof. They had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Niels took them in. He housed them in Ivor's chamber, which was warmer and more stable than the original tunnel. He fed them from his stores, and when Halvor asked how he could repay the debt, Niels said only, "Learn and teach others." That winter, 4 families used the Brecka underground system at various points. Some stayed for days during storms. Others came only to resupply when their own stores failed. Niels kept meticulous records of what came in and what went out, but he did not keep debts. The families who could repay him did. The families who could not were not turned away. By spring, 6 new chambers had been dug across the district. Each one was different, adapted to the soil, the water table, the resources available, but each one used the principles Niels had learned from Iver and refined through his own experience. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The third winter brought Silas Rook to his knees. Rook had refused to build underground. He had mocked the men who did, calling them moles and groundhogs. He had continued to stack his stores in an above-ground shed, trusting in thick walls and a deep foundation to protect his goods. The storm that came in February was not as severe as the great blizzard of '88. But it was severe enough. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. The wind packed snow against the west side of Rook's shed until the wall buckled. Water from melting snow on the roof leaked through the damaged wall and froze on the stored food. By the time the storm passed, half of Rook's provisions were ruined. Rook did not come to Niels himself. He sent a hired man, a young German named Wilhelm, who had worked for Rook since the previous summer. Wilhelm stood in the breaka yard with his hat in his hands and delivered the message. "Mr. Rook requests assistance. He has lost stores and requires food to see him through until spring. He offers payment." Niels looked at the young man. He looked at the shed. He thought about everything Rook had said and done, the mockery, the threats, the attempts to profit from other men's suffering. Then he went to the stores and began loading a sled. "Tell Mr. Rook that the food is given, not sold," Niels said. "Tell him there is no debt. Tell him the offer of payment is refused." Wilhelm looked confused. "He will not understand. He does not believe in gifts." "Then he will have to learn." The confrontation came 3 days later. Rook rode up to the breaka claim in the early afternoon. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse and stared at Niels, who was repairing a section of fence near the shed. "You humiliated me," Rook said. Niels did not stop working. "I fed you. You refused payment. You made it a charity. You made me look weak in front of the entire district. I made you look like a man who needed help and received it. That is not weakness. That is winter. Do not lecture me about winter. I have survived more winters than you have years on this prairie." Niels finally set down his tools. He walked to where Rook sat on his horse and looked up at him. "You have survived winters by buying the claims of men who did not survive. You have survived by making yourself necessary to the desperate. That is not survival. That is predation." Rook's face flushed. "You have no right. I have every right. I built something that works. I taught others how to build it. And when you needed help, I gave it to you without conditions. That is what survival looks like when it is not built on other men's suffering." Rook was silent for a long moment. The anger in his face did not fade, but something else crept in beneath it, something that might have been shame or fear or the beginning of understanding. "I will never ask you for help again," Rook said. "You may not need to, but if you do, the help will be there." Rook turned his horse and rode away. He did not look back. The years that followed blurred together in the way that years do when the work is steady and the crises are survivable. Niels and Marta had 2 more children, a son named Halvor, after Niels's father, and a daughter named Sigrid, after Marta's mother. The original cabin was expanded twice. The underground system grew until it connected 3 separate buildings and could shelter 12 people in the worst storms. Anna grew into a young woman who could cure vegetables and calculate rations better than most men twice her age. She married a farmer from the next county over, a man who had learned to build underground from one of Niels' students and moved to a claim of her own. Halvor took over the heavy work as Niels' shoulders began to fail. The injury from the collapsed tunnel arch, the one that had nearly broken him in the first year, never fully healed. By the time Niels was 50, he could not lift a beam without pain. By the time he was 60, he could barely lift an axe. But his hands still knew the work, and his voice still carried the knowledge. The teaching continued. Every autumn, before the first frost, men came to the Brecca claimed to learn. Some were new settlers who had heard the stories. Others were the sons of men who had learned from Niels a generation earlier. They came with shovels and lanterns and questions, and Niels answered them all. He showed them the original tunnel, still sound after 30 years. He showed them Ivar's chamber, now lined with timber that had seasoned to the color of honey. He showed them the ventilation system, the drainage channels, the storage zones for different types of food. The ground keeps what the air steals, he told them. But more than that, the ground keeps still when everything above it is moving. If you can learn to trust the stillness, you can survive anything the surface throws at you. Some of them understood. Some of them did not. The ones who understood went home and dug. The ones who did not went home and stacked wood above ground and hoped. Niels did not judge them. He had been one of them once. He had learned because he had no choice. Not everyone had that gift, the gift of having no options except the right one. The winter of 1912 was Niels's last. He was 70 years old. His shoulder ached constantly. His lungs had weakened from decades of cold air and underground dust. Marta had died 3 years earlier, quietly, in her sleep, and the cabin had felt empty ever since. But the chamber was still there. The stores were still stocked. The routines of preparation that he had followed for 40 years still held. On the morning of December 15th, Niels woke early and walked to the shed. The hatch was heavier than it used to be, or perhaps he was weaker. He descended the ladder carefully, one rung at a time, and stood in the chamber where he had saved his family a lifetime ago. The shelves were lined with provisions, potatoes, turnips, carrots, smoked meat, dried beans. The water barrels stood in the corner, just where they had always stood. The packed earth walls were smooth and cold and steady. Niels sat down on the same overturned bucket where Ivar had once sat. He thought about the old man's words. The ground keeps still when everything above it is moving. He had kept still, through storms and setbacks, through losses and triumphs, through the death of his wife and the growing of his children and the spreading of his knowledge across a district that had once thought him a fool. He had kept still and done the work. That evening Halvor found him in the chamber, slumped against the wall, his hands folded in his lap. His face was peaceful. His eyes were closed. They buried him on the same rise where Ivar lay, overlooking the creek that still ran clear and cold through the Dakota plain. Within 3 winters, 17 families in the district had built some version of the underground storage and shelter system Niels had taught. The children called them winter rooms, as if they had always existed, as if they were simply part of how people lived on the plains. The specific detail that proved the idea had crossed from innovation into ordinary life was this. By 1920, the term appeared in county agricultural reports without explanation, as if everyone knew what it meant. Niels Halvorsen Brecka lived out his life on the same Dakota claim where he had arrived with $31 and a family he could not afford to lose. In later years, he walked with a shoulder that never healed right, and every autumn he still tested the hatch with his own hand, feeling for the give that would mean the wood had started to rot. He died in the chamber he had built, surrounded by the provisions he had stored, in the stillness he had learned to trust. Motto. On January 11th, 1888, the temperature had dropped 50 degrees in less than a day. Ephraim Cutter had stood in the yard and told Niels the truth as he understood it. You keep your wife and that little girl in this county with one cabin and one stove, and the blizzard will bury all 3 of you together. The blizzard did bury the shed, the yard, the fence posts, and the road. But under the split oak and cottonwood stacked for winter, a square of darkness opened into lamplight, packed earth, hanging meat, and barrels beaded with cold. What looked like a man hiding labor under a woodpile was a man building a road his family could walk when the whole prairie vanished. The neighbors had laughed. The storekeeper had threatened. The old freighter had predicted death. And Niels Halverson Breke, standing in the dirt with a shovel in his hands, had kept digging until the digging saved them all.